talking about Hannah Arendt on Revolution today. It's our last book. It's a very difficult book. Very difficult book. My usual advice is do the reading before you come to lecture. In this case, I think coming to lecture and then doing the reading is actually going to be a benefit to most people. And the reason is the writing is very dense. It's a challenge. I think it's a good challenge. Sometimes reading something which is just a little beyond your grasp is helpful for kind of expanding your, let's call it your reading comprehension muscles, for strengthening your reading comprehension. And another reason it's difficult is there are just so many references and so many allusions and so many things Arendt takes for granted as background knowledge. And the average college student in 2020 in an intro-level poli-sci class doesn't have a lot of those references, allusions, and a lot of that background information. Okay, so it's not because understanding these illusions is beyond your capacity. It's more like you just haven't been exposed to them before. So I'm very happy to explain the most relevant ones for our purposes. Who was Hannah Arendt? That's the first thing I want to talk about. And then the second thing I want to talk about is the distinction between war and revolution that Arendt is trying to draw. Who is Hannah Arendt? Hannah Arendt was a German Jewish political theorist. She was born a little bit before Fanon, and she lived a little bit after Fanon. She studied philosophy in Germany with some of the biggest philosophers of her time. It was an unusual situation because then, as now, women were very underrepresented in the philosophy discipline. The problem is a little bit better now, but especially back then, Arendt was often, the only woman in her all otherwise male seminars and so forth. But philosophy was the least of her problems when, in the 1930s, the National Socialists, also known as the Nazis, started taking over the country and rising to power and making things very dangerous for people of Jewish descent, such as Hannah Arendt. So Arendt eventually fled to France. She spent some time in France working on behalf of other refugees, especially on behalf of Jewish children. She spent some time in basically a refugee camp. She was resettled, and she eventually relocated to the United States. And she was part of a wave, actually, of German Jewish intellectuals. They arrived on the the East Coast, but eventually Arendt taught in a variety of institutions. So not only New School in New York City, but also University of Chicago in the Midwest, also University of California at Berkeley. Okay, so she had a fairly illustrious academic career. And of all the political theorists that we're reading in this class, Hannah Arendt was the most kind of standard university professor. Political theory, not in the sense of, like a Fanon-like character who was participating directly in revolutionary politics of his time, never held a professorship. Arendt was, let's call it a professional intellectual, more of a traditional intellectual, and she did things like lecture in front of college classrooms. Okay, so speaking of which, I've got a clip here from her movie. So she got the biopic treatment. This is a movie called Hannah Arendt. This is Hannah Arendt speaking about the trial of Adolf Eichmann. So she was hired as a reporter to report on the trial of one of these Nazi bureaucrats who was being tried for war crimes against humanity in the post-war period. Okay, so that's all the setup I think you need to understand this clip. Okay, so that's Arendt talking about The Banality of Evil. And Arendt, when she went to this trial, was very surprised to find that Adolf Eichmann, was actually just this mild-mannered, well-spoken bureaucrat, really, whose primary defense was, I was just following orders. No matter that the orders led to and were complicit with the deaths of millions and millions of people in these concentration camps, in these death camps. Okay, so Arendt here is asking herself, what is this kind of politics? And her name for this banality of evil is totalitarianism. And totalitarianism, Arendt thought, had two distinct features. And the first we've already seen from the video clip. The first is a kind of thoughtlessness, a kind of inability to stop a minute and think about what you're doing. Okay, because Arendt actually entertains the frightening possibility that Eichmann was actually giving a, let's call it a truthful report of his experience. That being a bureaucrat in the National Socialist Party under the National Socialist regime was simply a matter of acting like a cog in the machine. This kind of thoughtlessness. And how did entire countries go along with National Socialism, for example? And Arendt's other big example of what she calls the totalitarian regime is the Soviet Union under Stalin. So Stalin was the successor to Lenin. According to Hannah Arendt, at least, Lenin was not a totalitarian, but the Stalinist period was totalitarian. And the same kind of thoughtlessness, Arendt thought, pertained to bureaucrats, to party members, and so forth in the Stalinist Soviet Union. Okay, the other major feature that Arendt is trying to pick out for us, the other major or distinguishing feature of totalitarianism, Arendt says, is terror. So terror is not just violence. According to Arendt, all governments use violence. All human beings, in some way or another, have done violence to something. You know, for Arendt, you can't have a state machinery without things like, army and police and so forth. Those are all instruments of violence. Okay, so what makes totalitarian regimes different? Well, for one thing, you don't know where the violence is going to hit. And this is part of the terror part. That totalitarian regimes practice terror against their own citizens in order to intimidate people into silence, in order to make them insecure about they never know whether they're on the right side of the regime or on the wrong side of the regime. Okay, and so these images of, stormtroopers busting into people's houses and searching their personal papers and so forth to see if they're enemies of the state or so forth, that's a kind of movie image, but that's the kind of thing that Hannah Arendt is talking about. And it's not just the ordinary citizens who are subject to this terror. As Arendt points out in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, this is a book that recently in the United States has gotten a lot of readership. As Arendt points out in her book, Origins of Totalitarianism, even the party members, even the government officials could never know if they were on the right side of Comrade Stalin's whims or if they were disfavored by the Führer, Hitler. And who knows, maybe you're favored one day and the next day you're on the outs. And one day you're the glorious hero of the revolution, and the next day you're a traitor to the revolution. Okay, so Arendt realizes that these totalitarian politics, these totalitarian regimes, were actually the result of revolutionary movements, revolutionary parties, and ultimately revolutionary politics. Okay, because the Soviet Union was not always like that, ruled by thoughtlessness and terror. Germany was not always ruled by the National Socialist Party. Okay, those regimes came into power around the same time, actually. Okay, so Arendt is saying, what is it about revolutionary politics that keeps leading to this totalitarian problem? Okay, and instead of saying, actually, all revolutionary politics are not worth it, actually, we should just purge revolution from our political imagination and purge this concept, revolution, from our political vocabulary. Arendt is trying to save revolutionary politics. That's in part what this book on revolution is about. She's trying to save revolutionary politics from its worst tendencies, from its totalitarian tendencies. So Arendt wants to look at a different time, in a different place, in a different set of revolutions. And Arendt, on her own account, is going back to the origins of the revolutionary, let's call it the revolutionary tradition. Okay, because yes, the word revolution is a very old is a very old word, and we're going to see Arendt trace out the history of this concept in future lectures. But you know, it goes all the way back to the ancient period. However, revolution was not always considered a good thing. Revolution was not always something considered necessary or desirable. Usually, it was actually considered a bad thing, something you were trying to avoid. But there came a time in the, let's call it the transatlantic world, the world on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, where revolution became this kind of new hope, or this principle of political organizing. And this was the 18th century, the late 18th century. And you had two revolutions following fairly quickly upon one another. And these were the United States Revolution and the French Revolution. And these, Arendt says, are the kinds of revolutions that she is interested in. Not the kind of revolution which is about cycling back to a previous state of affairs. That would have been like the Glorious Revolution, the revolution Locke was eager to justify. But revolutions that claimed that they were doing something new and bringing about a new state of affairs. So what did these modern revolutionaries aim at? What were they trying to accomplish? According to Arendt, they were trying to accomplish two things. And the first thing was done for the sake of the second thing. So the first task of the revolutionaries in what became the United States and France, the first task was to make a constitution. But why do you make the constitution? Not for its own sake. You make a constitution for the sake of freedom. And freedom has a very particular meaning here, which I'll get into soon. Okay. So it's kind of like Fanon. There are two phases to the revolution. Fanon said the first phase is the war of liberation, and the second phase is nation building. Okay. And then the first, you do the first so you can get to the second. Okay. For Arendt, it's a similar idea. There's two components to a revolutionary process, but you do one for the sake of the other. So let's start with the one. The first is you got to make a constitution. Okay, now this I know sounds maybe obvious, but for Arendt and in Arendt's time, constitution making was usually the last thing that people thought of when they thought of this word revolution. And maybe this is still true today. Maybe this is still true today. You know, when people think revolution, what they're actually thinking about is a kind of revolutionary war or a kind of armed rebellion that turns into a more organized political movement. Usually they're thinking about, Star Wars or the Hunger Games or, one of these fantasy sci-fi series. Okay, and those are all about the battles, basically. And Arendt is saying, actually, that wasn't the main thing back when the French and American revolutionaries were kicking off their revolutions. They knew that they wanted to found new constitutions, to create new ground rules for their societies, and to set up new forms of government. Okay, so constitution making was actually one of the innovations of the 18th century transatlantic revolutionaries, because prior to this, first of all, written constitutions were not that big of a deal. In the Glorious Revolution of Locke's time, for example, we talked about this. When Locke said you have to restore an earlier state of affairs, he was actually making an argument based on tradition. He was saying in the English Constitution, and this was not a written document, and still England doesn't have anything like this. The United Kingdom doesn't have anything like this. But in the English Constitution, there was a traditional arrangement between King, House of Lords, and House of Commons, and his claim was some kings would not abide by this tradition. Okay, but if you look at what the American revolutionaries were saying is the revolutionary process ends once you have a stable and new constitutional order. So these constitutional documents setting the basic rules, the constitutional law, that was considered to be a primary task. However, Arendt is very quick to point out, you don't make constitutional law for the sake of constitutional law. That's not why you set the basic rules of your society. That's not why you set up a government. I mean, you have to, the government, the new government actually has to, it can't just be this empty mechanism. It's got to serve some purpose. Now, what is the purpose, according to Arendt? Well, the purpose of a government is to allow citizens to be free. Okay, so you set up a new kind of government for the sake of freedom. Okay, and let's just use freedom as a placeholder, and we'll define it in a minute. But what Arendt is trying to avoid is a kind of John Locke-like political theory. Because you remember, John Locke's whole point is that in a legitimate civil society, in a society with a legitimate government, the role of the citizen is to actually be a private citizen. Now, for Fanon, as we just saw, that's kind of an oxymoron. His whole idea of citizenship is active participation. And Arendt has got a very similar idea. She says citizenship is an active participation in public affairs. Okay, so this John Locke idea that the primary role of the citizen is to be a private citizen and to basically take care of their family and to basically engage in market competition and transaction and to basically leave the governing to the public officials, to actually alienate their political power to public officials. Remember, this is the terms of the social contract. And then they don't do anything until that government starts misbehaving, until that government becomes a tyranny, and then they can rise up in violent resistance, overthrow the government, and so forth. But then, after the revolution is done, they should go back to their private lives again. And that is precisely the situation that Arendt is trying to avoid. Arendt is saying there was something new about the revolutionary politics of the French and the Americans, because their idea was, yes, first of all, in a revolution, you need broad-based participation. The people as a whole have got to be involved. But Arendt says both sets of revolutionaries were keenly aware of this problem, that in the post-revolutionary period, people would think, oh, well, we got the Constitution. Things are fine. Government's normal. I'll just go back to my private life. I will be the Lockean private citizen. I will no longer concern myself with politics. I will no longer have what Fanon calls social and political consciousness. So the question was, the big problem, Arendt says, for these revolutionaries was, how do you actually make a constitution that sets up a new kind of government? And what is this? What's going to be new about this kind of government? This government will allow for ongoing participation of ordinary people after the revolution is done. Okay, so that is a dilemma, and Arendt is going to come back to it. So when we get to Arendt chapter 6, our last chapter in Arendt, we'll talk about this problem once more. So if you don't quite get it, don't worry, we're coming back to it. Okay. Why is it, Arendt asks, that whenever we think of this term revolution, and this would have been true back in the 60s when Arendt was writing, and this would be true today, I would say, if my understanding of these Hollywood movies is right. Why is it whenever we think of the word revolution, the word war is never far from our minds? Why do we often think that war, sorry, let's start that sentence over. Why do we think that revolution is really a kind of war? Usually a kind of civil war, but sometimes a kind of war of liberation, as in the case of Fanon. Okay, Arendt is saying, well, for one thing, we don't have our concepts all that well sussed out. We don't have our understandings of what the aims of war and what the aims of liberation what the aims of war and what the aims of revolution actually are. So Arendt is going to try and draw a fine line distinction between what she's going to call revolutionary war and revolution proper. And this is the main thing I want you guys to take from the intro of On Revolution. So what is revolutionary war? For Arendt, revolutionary war aims at liberation. And we have a very similar idea in Frantz Fanon, because you remember, he calls decolonial war a war of liberation. So what is a war of liberation? What is a revolutionary war? Well, it's a tearing down of oppression, or it's a resistance to occupation. So the idea is somebody is oppressing your social group, say the colonized in Wretched of the Earth, or somebody is occupying your country, which is one way you could actually look at what the French were doing in Algeria. But this kind of thing, in Arendt's imagination, would have happened in France during the German occupation. So as some of you history buffs may know, in World War II, Germany basically turned France into a colony, and it got this government, the Vichy government, to collaborate and legitimate the Nazi occupation of France. But as we know, there were French resistance fighters. And so when you hear these terms about, long live the resistance and so forth, what you know is, even though the government, or the supposed government of France, was collaborating with the Nazi occupation, there were always ordinary citizens, they were patriots, they were resistance fighters, who were basically arming themselves in fighting these irregular wars, sniping, for example, they were called free shooters, some of them. And as you saw, when the Allied forces, the British and the Americans and Canadians and so forth came to, quote, liberate France, these French resistance fighters often collaborated with these regular troops, the guys in uniforms that you can see in this picture. So on the right, you've got some resistance fighters, and on the left, you've got the regular troops. Okay, so yeah, that's a kind of liberation. And the regime toppled. The French regime, the collaborating regime, toppled. Okay, so there was a revolutionary kind of war there. Okay, and it's the same difference, of course. I've gone over this example at some length, but it's the same difference with the Algerian liberation fighters who were fighting with Fanon, who was also involved in organizing military maneuvers and so forth, shipping weapons around and so forth. He was a military strategist as well as a political theorist. Here we've got a picture of a woman fighting for the FLN, for Algeria's independence. Okay, so what is all this? This is revolutionary war. It's the tearing down of oppression. It's the resistance to an occupation. It's the use of violence to counter somebody else's violence. Okay, but what is revolution proper, Arendt says? Well, revolution proper is not about liberating you from some violent oppression. I mean, you've got to do that, Arendt would say. If somebody is violently oppressing you, yeah, you should probably use violence against them to get yourself free from that terrible situation. But that's not what revolution proper is. So as we already saw, revolution proper has got this constitutional component built into it. And Arendt is, by defining revolution in this way, she's insisting on the centrality of constitution and constitutional foundings. Okay, but as we already saw, constitutional foundings is supposed to aim at freedom. Now, what is freedom here? In a Lockean political theory, freedom means your ability to choose in the absence of arbitrary constraint. Another way of putting it is, for Locke, civil freedom means an individual can make choices for those matters that affect them the most within the scope of the law. So you can do whatever you want, basically, as long as you're not harming people. What's harming people? Well, that has been defined by law. Okay, be it natural law, the civil law, or whatever. But what you see here is that freedom for Locke is an individual's possession. Okay, it's a very different idea of freedom for Hannah Arendt, because what is the kind of freedom that you would have expressed in a revolutionary politics? This is the freedom to participate in a collective enterprise. This is the freedom to participate in the process of establishing a constitution, for example. So, for example, if the citizenry at large is debating, hey, what should the new constitution be? And should we, okay, so some framers came up with this new kind of government, and now they want us to ratify this constitution. They want us to adopt this constitution for the entire country. Should we do it? Should we not? Well, we should debate about it, and then we should make a decision. That's revolutionary freedom. Okay, so building up this new form of government, that's an expression of your freedom. And as you can see here, it's not an individual thing. I mean, the individual, if they're taking part in these public debates, well, I think this new constitution is tyrannical, it's even worse than the last one. Okay, yes, but they're talking in public. They're talking to other individuals. They're trying to persuade other people. And they're trying to debate about something that not only involves themselves and their families, but the broader society and the broader public, the public at large. Okay, and it's that kind of thing, that kind of freedom, that Arendt wants to carry over into the post-revolutionary period. So it's not just building up self-government, it's sustaining self-government. And by self-government, we mean the ability of a citizenry as a whole to govern themselves. Okay, not an individual making choices for themselves, private choices that only affect them, but a citizenry having some say in the laws the government passes, in the policy the government enacts, making these decisions about peace and war, for example, making decisions about where does the money get spent, for example. Okay? That's self-government. That's got self-government, taking part in the political process. And Arendt's word for that is freedom.